Hi, Neil. Can you let me know if you can hear us? Okay. Hello. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you guys very much for coming to our talk tonight. This is one of our last events of this term, so thank you for keeping up with us and for continuing to show up for another great talk. And also special thanks for making the time to be here today, because we know that our talk today happens to overlap with the vigil for Ukraine that the university is also hosting. So we appreciate you guys being here, and just in appreciation of everything that's happening in Ukraine, and which is also like extremely relevant to the work that we do and the things that we're interested in. We thought we'd just start by having a minute of silence, and then we'll go ahead and continue with their talk. So. Okay, thank you very much, guys. So today we have Katy Murray, who's joining us from London. She's the Insights and Relationships Lead at Cast from Clay, and I think Katy is going to briefly introduce also what Cast from Clay is and what they do. But I think in a super brief way, they're a policy and research communications consultancy, and they do a lot of work with just like communicating insights and opinions and perspectives that experts have in a way that makes them sort of more accessible and visible. She has nearly 10 years of experience in policy and research communications. And we're very excited to have her talk to us today because, as most of you guys know, because you're familiar with the work we've been doing this term, we've really placed a lot of emphasis on trying to bridge the divide between like the theory of how misinformation works and how we should address it with the practicalities of what that actually looks like when you're implementing it on the ground. And so we're very excited to have Katy talk to us today about conspiracy theories, what we can learn from them, and maybe potentially proposing like a slightly alternative way of approaching people who subscribe to these kinds of theories. So I don't want to take up any more time, so I'll just pass over to Katy, and I think we can start.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophia, for having me, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's great to meet you all, and kind of thank you for joining, especially as I know that you're approaching exam season and it's pressure's on. So it's really nice to be here today. Just as we're sitting and the title, what can we learn from conspiracy theories is kind of up on the screen. I want to just invite you guys to notice if that question is bringing any responses up for you, whether you think it's a perfectly ordinary question, whether you think, whether it sparks some curiosity for you, or whether it brings up any discomfort for you around what could we possibly learn for conspiracy theories when they're all nonsense. And that's kind of, because that's kind of going to be a kind of overarching theme of the talk today. But yeah, just to briefly introduce, my name's Katy. I work at an organisation called Cast from Clay. This is not our usual font, and my boss is probably going to kill me, but it's fine. Yeah, so Sophia, you explained that really well. Thank you. Yeah, our organisation was founded in response to what we perceived was a kind of a struggle by experts to communicate their research to non-expert audiences and to meaningfully engage the public in the research that they were finding. So we work with a lot of think tanks, universities, research institutes, many of whom still sometimes labour under the kind of belief or hope that facts and evidence are enough to kind of give an argument and convince people, which sadly is not the case. And so we kind of work to relieve them of this belief and give them the tools to better communicate their evidence in a way that kind of recognises the humanity of their audiences. So that's where I come at conspiracy theories from. I'm not, by any means a kind of expert in this topic, but really kind of approach this topic partly from that interest in kind of the role of experts and scientific and academic communication, and how conspiracy theories kind of fit into that picture. So because of that, this isn't so much a work of sort of scientific or pseudo-scientific inquiry, but potentially a work of more sort of philosophical thinking or kind of thought experiment. And that's why I want to start with this quote from Zizek, which says that the task of philosophy is not to provide the answers, but to show that the way we perceive a problem can sometimes itself be actually part of the problem. And so that's my starting point here. Just got a note in the chat. Oh, that's it. I just want to check there's no one like that. So yeah, so that's kind of the starting point for this talk. I tried to keep it short. It turns out there's quite a lot to say, but I'm going to try and whiz through it and then really want to chat to all you guys and hear what you think. But I'm going to cover kind of 3 topics. First and foremost, the lure of us and them, and kind of that being the problem with the perception of the problem. Try and have a quick look at how the rabbit hole works and what's going on in there, and then thinking about how we can maybe start to think about conspiracy theories as an us problem, not an us and them problem, looking at them as a bit more like myth and metaphor and a kind of mirror to society. So that's what to expect from the talk. So to start with, the lure of us and them. So whether it's us and them, believers and non-believers, skeptics and truth seekers, us and them is so much a part of the kind of the conspiracy theory debate that it's going to be really difficult for me to talk about the topic without kind of reverting to that binary. I'm gonna try, but in order to kind of backtrack a little bit, I'm just going to explain a little bit more about how I got here, because I think it sort of is kind of illustrative. This kind of inquiry into conspiracy theory started for me with the pandemic, as I think it did for a lot of people actually, given that it became very much a kind of pressing topic around COVID. speculation about the cause of COVID, any links to technology, and skepticism about vaccines as well. There was a specific trigger, but it's a little bit of a long story, which is a rabbit hole in and of itself. So I won't try and explain that now. But as I began to read a little bit more about conspiracy theories, the main question in my mind was, what do people actually believe when they believe conspiracy theories? And more importantly, why do they believe that? And so as I was kind of looking into this and kind of getting a bit curious about conspiracy theories, I sort of discovered that there was quite a rich world of belief out there. There was all of these spooky stories and symbolism and merchandise, and also multiple kind of drivers for that belief. And what I discovered as I started to get curious in what I felt was a purely academic way, I wanted to talk to people in my life about this interest, so friends and family, and I kind of wanted to show them this like amazing world that I was uncovering, this richness, this huge library, and I thought they would be really interested too and be like, yeah, Katy, this is really cool, this is so interesting, and to some extent they are. This is maybe a little bit unfair, but I think when I very first started talking about it, I sort of began to feel a little bit like I was sounding like a conspiracy theorist. And I noticed that a lot of the facial expressions of my friends and family, there was a sort of look in the eye of maybe a slight wall going up, a slight guardedness, to start thinking, okay, what's going on here? What's she actually saying? Does she actually believe? And it is really difficult to talk about conspiracy theories without sounding like a conspiracy theorist. And that's kind of part of the risk and the danger of conspiracy theories themselves. And so having this experience, I realized that beforehand, even though I might have thought this wasn't the case, I thought that my mind worked a little bit like, so I could easily categorize information that came in and triage it very simply into this thing is a true thing and this thing is a not true thing. And that conspiracy theories sit firmly in the not true thing, and we can close that book and get on with our lives. And what we actually discover is, and this is a really great chart by Abby Richards, who does a lot of work on conspiracy theories. I don't know if you guys have seen it before. It might be quite hard to read the detail of that, but it's really worth seeking this out online. Is that there isn't a sort of not true spectrum within conspiracy theories, but there's actually kind of a spectrum of reality that different conspiracy theories are kind of grounded within or very much not grounded within. So you can see that at the very top, the detached from reality section there, we've got things like QAnon, Holocaust denial, flat Earth, and in a kind of quite dangerous category as well, in that it can cause harm to others, as we saw with QAnon and Pizzagate. There's this kind of spectrum within the middle around relatively harmless, but definitely not true. But then towards the bottom of that kind of pyramid, the bottom end of the spike, we've got things that actually were grounded in reality, could sound like a conspiracy theory, like Free Britney, but did actually turn out to be true as well. That there's evidence around the tobacco industry suppressing a link between cigarettes and cancer. So the risk of having this true, not true binary, this us and them binary, is that one is that we reject real inquiry into abuse of power and kind of sinister forces at work, and it makes the discussion very difficult to talk about. So what I realized was going on with me and also my friends and family was less that they were working with this kind of true, not true sort of binary in their minds, that it was easy to categorize information, but more that many of us, our minds work with a lot more of a kind of that must be true or that can't be true. And the way that works is that it's to do with sustaining your existing worldview and not letting in information that challenges your existing worldview because it's kind of too dangerous and too destabilizing. And what I saw there was this kind of big knowledge barrier that people were putting up as I was talking to them to say, this sounds dangerous, I'm going to kind of put my defenses up a little bit. And it's something that we all do, and it's kind of backed up by kind of behavioral insights. And I want to kind of just quickly touch on that, just to kind of give you guys a bit more context. Some of you are nodding, so it sounds like you've heard this before. But this is from the book Perils of Perception by Bobby Duffy, talking about how our perceptions can be easily misled. And in this book, he refers to some research that was done to ask people how they perceive their levels of immigration within their country. So the top bar, the pink bar, is the guess. And as you can see, the guesses are much higher than the lower bar, the dark bar, which is the actual reality, showing the percentage of the population that were immigrant. So that's interesting, but it's not that surprising. We know that immigration is a highly charged topic. It's difficult to discuss, and many people sort of see it as maybe more extreme than it is. But what gets really interesting in this book is when the people they questioned were challenged or shown the reality, the real statistics, was that many of the respondents insisted that their original guess or estimate was accurate. And the top two reasons they gave were that the government's figures were wrong, and they don't include illegal immigration, or they just said, I just don't believe you. That piece of evidence, that piece of the puzzle is not enough. It doesn't fit within my wider worldview, and so I can just reject it. And that's sort of expressed really nicely here by George Lakoff in his book, Don't Think of an Elephant. He says, one of the fundamental findings of cognitive science is that people think in terms of frames and metaphors. When the facts don't fit the frames are kept and the facts are ignored. And so just to expand a little bit on what we mean by frames, this is from a really great piece that's worth a read by Whitney Phillips, who's a professor in communications at Syracuse University. And it's called Please, Please, Please Don't Mock Conspiracy Theories in Wired magazine. She explains these frames and what she calls deep mimetic frames. And these are what we believe in our bones to be true about the world. They emerge from our education, our experiences, and how we're culturally conditioned to interpret information. Some are tethered to empirical reality, some less so, and some not at all. Regardless, they shape how we see and what we know or what we think we know, so completely that we probably don't even notice them. So I think this goes back a little bit to what I was saying before about me and my friends and my family. This can't be true and must be true division within our minds, and then this knowledge barrier that we put up between those two things in order to protect our existing worldviews. And kind of drawing on that Whitney Phillips argument, that article, there are quite a few ways that we see this knowledge barrier maintaining itself within, skeptics and non-believers and people who are kind of critical of conspiracy theories. And that is, we see that knowledge barrier manifesting and being maintained by mocking, by belittling, by judging, and by denigrating. And I kind of wanted to use a recent example of this because I spotted it and I thought it was quite a useful illustration of when our responses to conspiracy theories can border into kind of the unhelpful category. And I don't know if you guys caught the news story recently of Keir Starmer, leader of the opposition, and David Lammy. Outside Parliament, a kind of group of protesters surrounded them and started shouting quite a lot of things at them, which is sadly not an uncommon occurrence these days. So there was a big discussion after that happened because one of the protesters shouted Jimmy Savile at Keir Starmer. And then there was a debate within the news as to whether some of these protesters had been emboldened by Boris Johnson seeming to accuse Keir Starmer of not prosecuting Jimmy Savile when he was working at CPS. So I'm using this example because I was watching how the narratives were kind of responding to this, whether they were, on the one hand was saying that Boris Johnson, what he said was very dangerous and it was kind of amounted to dog whistle, and he was emboldening people who were kind of concerned about this kind of, paedophilic cabal, running the country, etc. Versus the kind of the counter narrative. And it seemed to me that the counter narrative was to simply dismiss the protesters as crazy. So this came from Politico's London Playbook. They stated that doubling down, a government source indicated that the government wouldn't back down from their position, countering the role that Boris Johnson words might have played in emboldening the protesters by saying this was a bunch of vile anti-vaxxers and anti-government loons. So that was their kind of defense or argument against. And some of you may have seen the video. It's only one protester who shouts Jimmy Savile, and Tom Harwood, who we're about to talk about, talked about how the group may have had a wider history of kind of conspiracy theory beliefs, and were there talking about lots of different things. But in their kind of piece to camera that Tom Harwood, the GB News journalist, gave, he described the protesters as a horrific mob, a baying mob of great unwashed anti-vaxxers, and kind of low-key questions their humanity by questioning whether it's right that any human beings think that behaviour is in any way acceptable. So it's quite an extreme reaction, and if you watch the footage, it's quite extreme behaviour, and it can be kind of natural to respond by saying, "Oh my God, what are these people doing?" This is a 5-minute talk that Tom Harwood gives, and he goes on, and I've sort of like written down all of the arguments that he makes, the kind of descriptors that he uses about the protesters. He calls them a hateful mob, a pathetic mob, spawned from a rabble, troublemakers, a loopy gathering, a rabble of lunatics, COVID radicalized anti-vax nutjobs, QAnon conspiracy inspired lunatics, unruly mob, lowlives, crowd of cretins, these morons. So there's quite a lot there. I had in my head the question while watching this: does that actually help? Does that get us anywhere? Is it necessary condemnation to avoid kind of contamination of what we see as unacceptable behaviour and unacceptable belief? Or are we radicalising each other? Are we just further polarising each other by having a response like that? I think it's a really important question to ask, because it enforces us to recognise that we are all in a dynamic together. And it's also important to recognise that it's easy to look at kind of people who believe in conspiracy theories and say that they have this binary thinking of things that they don't want to accept to be true. The same happens for everyone. So you could argue whether it was knowing or not knowing from that kind of response from some journalists and from government sources. It seemed to be that the kind of rationale that they had used was, it can't be true that there are people out there who relate more to these conspiracy theory stories than our prevailing societal narrative, that then in a way implicates us to kind of do something about that, maybe change how we communicate, try and change, explain how the world works in potentially more accessible and relatable ways. They're all just crazy. We can't do anything about it. That's their problem. It doesn't have any implications for us. And I think that's the real challenge. So going back to that Whitney Phillips piece, she argues making fun of conspiracy theories, however tempting it might be, is the worst possible reaction. This is not a civility argument, nor is it a claim that false information is cool and fun and we should just shrug and say nothing. Rather, it's a warning that jokes about conspiracy theories are strategically ineffective. In fact, they're likely to backfire and dump even more refuse into the already toxic political waters. And so at that stage, I'm kind of arguing that, like in relationships, Esther Perel is a psychotherapist who focuses on relationships, and this is a quote from her. She says, if you want to change the other, change you. You're in a relationship and you're in a dynamic. It's really frustrating that people won't listen to you and listen to your arguments, or that might think things that you think, how can you possibly think that? It helps to get curious, and it helps to kind of think about where they might be coming from. That can help to think about how you might communicate or engage in discussion with them. So I'm aware I've been talking for a fair amount, but there's still a fair amount to get through. Before we get into the next part of the talk, I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts so far, any questions or any kind of reflections, given especially that I asked some kind of big questions there about, do we condemn or are we just radicalizing each other? Yeah.
Well, I'm also thinking about this because you work in a policy communications consultancy. But I think, like, going back to what you mentioned earlier in your talk with like the figures for immigration and things like that, I think that's pointing to, like, I guess maybe you'll get into this now, so if I'm but it seems like one of the fundamental issues here is like an erosion of trust for institutions and government and, you know, authority as a whole. And so, because also I guess this is largely what you do professionally, as well as advise like people on communicating policy, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how to address that.
Yeah, so many. I will come up in terms of how to address it, but I think it's really important that you've raised trust as an issue, because it is really, really key. And I think what to kind of bring into the wider context of that that kind of Keir Starmer anti-vaxxer protest debate. Remember that what was happening at the time was Boris Johnson and his party were dealing with this kind of huge scandal around the Christmas parties during a really severe lockdown at Christmas, in which there was a huge amount of anger and feeling that, you know, it's one more for us and there's another more from them. So then we get into the us and them dynamic again. This sense that someone once said to me, trusts arrive on foot and leaves on horseback. So it's really hard to gain trust. It takes a really long time, and it's so easy to break it, and particularly when it comes to kind of from the government perspective. When that kind of party scandals were breaking, I was thinking about all the poor people that were probably working really hard in communications around the pandemic to gain trust and to get people to kind of trust that the government knew what it was doing and that these regulations were, you know, meant for people's own good and to kind of protect their health, all kind of squandered by what was perceived to be a kind of one rule for them and one rule for the other. So trust is really, really key to this. So thank you for raising it. Does anyone else have any thoughts before I head into the rabbit hole?
Maybe later.
Okay, we can discuss. I'm interested. So yeah, a glimpse a little bit, I think, kind of trying to hold off the initial defense reaction of, okay, that sounds crazy, I'm not going to engage, enough to stay curious to see what maybe is going on. For some people, sometimes conspiracy theories is a kind of complicated world, but I think this is quite a useful starting point, at least to try and claw back a little bit of common ground and space for discussion. And a really important piece for me was reading this book, Going Dark, The Secret Social Lives of Extremists. I don't know if any of you have read it. It's a really worthwhile read. It's not strictly about conspiracy theories, but it is about extreme beliefs and the kind of process of radicalization, and particularly focuses on the kind of social glue that holds together a lot of these groups, and that many people go to kind of find some sort of social belonging. Julia Abner was a researcher at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which is a think tank that focuses on extremism and terrorism. So that was so very much from the world that I kind of work with, and it's a really great read. So she talks about the reason for writing this book was that she kind of felt frustrated that as an academic researcher, she was not really getting the insight that she needed into how these groups really work. So she sort of went undercover online into various different extremist forums. So she goes into really extreme white supremacy forums. ISIS Brides, a Telegram group, I think at one point. She goes to a few places in person as well. But there's a moment in the book, because some of the kind of thesis that she works around is the role of vulnerability, individual vulnerability plays in the kind of radicalization process. And there's a moment in the book where she talks about going into a group called Tradwives. I don't know if you are familiar with Tradwives, but the way she describes it is they're kind of a branch of men's rights activism, who believe that really women and men should take traditional roles in relationships. Women should be kind of obedient to the man, they're very anti-feminist and very anti kind of gender equality, and that the world would be much better if we kind of stuck with the sort of gender roles as they had been. And she describes how at the moment that she was kind of infiltrating these groups, she always has to kind of create a backstory to get in there. She'd just come out of a relationship with a man and was feeling particularly kind of vulnerable to questions around how you function within a relationship and how you kind of build a successful relationship. And she says, for the first time, I don't have to pretend to be vulnerable. The insecurities that I write about are real. The fears that I express are authentic. And I think that's really key, because, and it's something that I could kind of really kind of made it make sense to me, was that It's less that there's a kind of specific demographic exactly that could get drawn into conspiracy theory beliefs, which is why I think it's false to think about it as, those crazy people and like us smart, clever people. I think Julia Ebner really shows that we can all be vulnerable at different phases in our lives. And in a way, it's a lot about timing and being in the wrong place at the wrong time when a particular narrative comes your way, and potential for you to find it appealing. And this is a quote I like from Johann Hari, the journalist, who says, "Giving a person a story about why they are in pain is one of the most powerful things you can do." So like I've said, we are all potentially vulnerable. So thinking about this is the kind of an us question. Just to very quickly, if I can, go into a few elements of the kind of what the lure is within conspiracy theories. Some of you might be familiar with some of these ideas already. They're out there, and I'm very much drawing on stuff that I've read and kind of knitted together. I'll leave some references at the end. But I think it's Karen Douglas at University of Kent who studies the kind of more psychology around conspiracy theories. She talks about kind of three elements that really draw people in, one of them being knowledge. So like I've said, this kind of explaining, giving an explanation to a painful question, the sense that this makes much more sense than other explanations I've received, potentially that kind of trust issue, trust of where you're receiving your information from as well. Getting into it must be true category because it has to be true, or I need it to be true, or I want it to be true. Then the safety and certainty of sometimes the kind of ephemeral difficulties that we have in our lives, loneliness, isolation, alienation, a feeling that there's a real problem and I just have no idea how to fix it, making that problem tangible. So for Julia Ebner, the tangibility thing was feminism is the problem, just reject all feminist kind of beliefs and you'll have a successful relationship. This kind of easy answer. Or, the bad guys are out there, we just have to find them and fight them, and they're the cause of all of our problems. And then there's a real social element to it as well, kind of as Julia Ebner outlines in her book, finding a bit of a tribe. You see when you look at flat earthers that they have like merchandise and conventions, and there's a real sense of finding a community. And that plays a really key role when maybe you start to get more into conspiracy theories, you talk to people about it, and you find some of that social rejection happening, some of those barriers coming up with friends and family, where you then start to think, oh, some people don't get me, but these guys do. And you kind of, and that's when conspiracy theories start to get really sticky. There are elements within it that within conspiracy theories that mean that lure kind of latches on. So it's burden of evidence. Some of you might be familiar with this, that the logic of a lot of conspiracy theories works with the burden of evidence in the inverse to what we usually use in society. So if you're in a courtroom trying to kind of convict someone of a crime, the burden of evidence is to prove that it, beyond all reasonable doubt, that it did happen, not where is the proof that it didn't happen. It's really difficult to prove that something didn't happen. You're looking for evidence that something very much did take place. And so a lot of conspiracy theories work with that logic, and then kind of anything is possible at that point. They're quite self-sealing, so quite a lot of the logic of conspiracy theories means that there's potentially a kind of other group. If you believe that mainstream media are controlling our minds, and then we get into a discussion and I disagree with you, then you say, well, you would think that because the mainstream media is controlling your mind. So that's a kind of well-known element of conspiracy theories, is that once you kind of get into that thinking, you're kind of sealed off from other information entering, a bit like the knowledge barrier we see on the other side that I talked about before. And then the social element as well, there's that sunk, there's a kind of a sunk cost element. If you've already kind of committed, if you socially pinned your colours to the mast, if you started posting about this online, if you've lost friends or family members because of your kind of interest in conspiracy theories, there's a sense of which I've already lost or invested so much in this part of my identity, I don't want to give that up, or I'm committed now, I'm invested. So that's what kind of, those are three key elements that make conspiracy theories really, really sticky once you're in them. And I kind of think, just to very briefly move on from this point, but there are these kind of push-pull factors. So within the knowledge camp, it's like this, having this information feels good, But then there's also a fear factor of what if it turns out to be true and I didn't believe it? What if this, paedophile, sex trafficking, government satanic cabal was true and I didn't do anything about it? That would make it my fault. There's that fear. There's a sense of, oh, I'm scared of evil forces in the world, but now I have a purpose in defeating those evil forces. And another push-pull of, I feel like I belong here and I feel like I'm worth something, but if I don't follow what everyone is saying, then I'll be ostracized. So there's the kind of love and fear going on in there. And so with that, we can imagine what might be going on for some believers. Again, some believers, some of the time. It's easy once you understand that to kind of empathize with what might be driving some of the beliefs. So, for example, it can't be true that the world is chaotic and everyone's just winging it and no one is truly in charge. It must be true that someone is making this all happen. They're planning this for their own gain, but then at least someone's in control, and potentially we can seize that control and change things. So the pandemic is planned. It could be one thing at play here with things like pandemic and the kind of COVID hoax narrative. This is one potential factor that could be kind of powering this sense of this kind of evil people are running the world. The other alternative is people in power just don't know or care about me and my life. It's not kind of from intent. It's actually from neglect that these things are happening. So it can't be true that I must not be important. So it must be true that people in power are secretly plotting against me and my peers, and that's why all this bad stuff is happening in my life. Therefore, I must be important enough to fix this. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of some elements of kind of what can happen and what can draw people into real conspiracy theory belief and that kind of radicalization process. There are lots of things out there that describe how that belief is different for different people and can sometimes be kind of a bit of fun for some people and a bit of enjoyment, and it's not kind of real, and there's a bit of a suspension of disbelief. And then there's also the whole question of the kind of those involved in conspiracy theories as a way of gaining power and control, and who knowingly kind of spread disinformation. But I'm kind of specifically talking about how individuals might get drawn into it, into true belief. But I think it's difficult when we talk about the individual level, because to some extent it is conjecture, and to some extent, that when we make it about the individual, that can then get into they're all crazy and kind of blaming individuals. So that's why I think it's useful to think a little bit about conspiracy theories a bit more as sort of myth, as metaphor, as kind of mirrors to society. Try and think about the fact that they're really about us and our world, and what they tell us. So they're cultural artifacts like art and myths and fables. So they tell us about the society that produces them. And kind of one way to think about conspiracy theories is they're a bit like a kind of slightly twisted version of like what if movies. You think about what if movies like The Matrix. What if the reality, as we know, is a simulation? Get Out is a sort of what if, or it's as if white people were literally colonizing black people's minds and bodies. There's a podcast that I referenced at the end that kind of uses this analogy. It's a really good piece. And don't look up. I saw you guys had a film club about this as a really good kind of analogy for climate change. It's like it's as if there's a comet heading for Earth, and no one actually cares. No one's listening to the scientists. And conspiracy theories are kind of doing that, but there's not that it's as if. It's like it's literal. There's a literal element to it. So flat Earth, for example, you remove the it's as if. The world is not really the way we say it is, but it's kind of like they're saying it's as if the world is not the way I'm being told it is. I think flat Earth is really interesting because they're literally contesting the shape of reality. Like that's massive, and also like a really beautiful metaphor for the sense that it's almost as if, because of polarization and because of these quite varying us and them, experts and truth seekers, crazy people and kind of normies, we're completely kind of occupying different terrain. The people in power are so different and separate to real people. This gets back to the trust issue sphere. It's as if they're not human, and you get into kind of lizard people territory. all these bad and disruptive forces that are upending our lives. I see connections between them. I didn't ask for 5G, I didn't ask for COVID, but they've really screwed up my life. There must be a connection here, they must be connected. And so just really briefly going back to this kind of the lure and the latch, kind of see the link between kind of how this kind of individual belief and individual kind of lure into conspiracy theories, and then what's kind of cited within conspiracy theories that makes them attractive. But kind of wanted to look one level up from that. So to get into your question, Sophia, about kind of what is to be done about that. I don't claim to have all of the answers, but I think some of the drivers, when we take one step back from the kind of the knowledge and the safety and the certainty and the social elements that people could be looking for here, is that narratives, there are narratives that just don't consider those mimetic frames. We talk to people as if they have the same worldview as us, and many people just don't, and we need to find ways to work out where people are and can communicate with them from that perspective rather than just kind of speak from our perspective. This kind of broader societal issue of kind of emergent disruptive forces that are really hard to explain and impact people unequally, like the recession, like the fourth industrial revolution, like the pandemic, like globalization. And that feeds then into the kind of the mimetic frames and how we talk about all of these huge societal changes. And then what we talked about at the very beginning, this ostracization of anyone who doesn't get it or who questions dominant narratives, to say you're crazy, you're a freak. We are finishing, guys. So just to summarize, 3 key challenges then that I've just gone over: these disruptive forces, the narratives that don't consider mimetic frames, and ostracization of anyone who doesn't get it. And the suggestion that are 3 ways forward, which is recognizing that fear and alienation that's being communicated here, and to try and work better, maybe to involve citizens and empower them. And that can come in through how we communicate with each other. So understanding and communicating with each other, understanding that others' mimetic frames, rather than just speaking again from our own perspectives. And then avoid blaming and othering people who aren't on board yet, and trying to think about calling them in rather than kind of casting them out, because again, it only just sends people further down the rabbit hole. So I wanted to kind of leave with this quote from the French philosopher Simone Weil. And she, I don't know if you guys heard the analogy, but she uses the analogy of the 2 prisoners who communicate by tapping on a cell wall. And she says that the wall is what separates them, but it's also what connects them and it allows them to communicate. And I kind of want to leave you with that image. So yeah, I've got some references at the end that I can suggest. This is where I've drawn a lot of my kind of thoughts from. But yeah, really keen to hear any questions, any comments, any fierce debate that you guys want to have. You look like you have lots of questions. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. That was such a good talk. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, I'm glad.
I was watching the YouTube on my way. One thing I was thinking, so I'm really glad you touched on Karen Douglas's work and then kind of derived action from that.
Mm.
One thing I've been thinking about is, we've been thinking about workshops, etc., and the current dominant narrative on how we self-inoculate and that kind of stuff is very much based on critical thinking, understanding of biases, media literacy, data literacy, that kind of stuff. It's been with between us when we've talked about this, there's a lot to be talked about understanding these motives in the first place. I know when you talk about reaching across the aisle and all of that suggestions towards the end, that is very much about the people who are already in a very different mimetic frame than we are in. But when we're thinking about people who are probably more in the middle, for which ourselves very much fall into that category, would you say there is value in promoting this framework of understanding how one might become vulnerable to misinformation later in life? For example, for me to appreciate that in my home, I have very valid reason to distrust my government or my trust system, and therefore I'm less likely to reject what the signs that they say or promote. Have you had a way of thinking about how you might inoculate people psychologically before the critical thinking parts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I've heard and I think it probably was from Karen Douglas, this idea of thinking about, and actually I think there's an Ant Hill podcast, there's a series of An Expert's Guide to Conspiracy Theories, and they also refer to this, and I think it's when they talk to Karen Douglas, this idea that, yeah, it's actually much easier to inoculation is a really great metaphor that they've been using to talk about this. It's much easier to kind of prevent people from kind of walking down and kind of being too far gone in that sense. And I think, and that's exactly what they talk about, is kind of raising awareness generally about how to be aware of our own. And I think that's why I started with, and that was my starting point for the piece, was starting with people who think I would never believe a conspiracy, I would never get trolled. You know, there's that statistic that goes around that says that we probably believe at least one, like everyone probably believes at least one. So the sense of self-awareness is really important for, I've kind of made the case here that it's really important for aiding discussion to kind of create a bit of kind of way of connecting to each other. But I think you're right in the sense of being able to be wary about where we're getting our sources from, and where, when we hear a piece of information, we say to ourselves, do I accept that because it feels good or because it fits or it doesn't challenge me? And I think this is what was really interesting about kind of my journey into this, was that I'd been working for an organization who's been talking about behavioral insights to people for a long time and saying, you know, we only accept what we kind of already fits into our worldview. But it was really only when I kind of experienced it firsthand to be like, what is it like to be talking to people about something who don't actually already share my beliefs? Because it's really easy for us to do, is kind of form these networks form these kind of social groups around people who share our beliefs anyway, and we never get challenged on them and we never question them. And that's often what's happening when people enter online spaces as well. It's really easy to just search something online and find something that supports your existing belief. There's a forum about it, there's an article about it. So yeah, I think having that awareness to be like, just see what the other side's saying, or go see, kind of search the opposite and see what other people are saying, and kind of make up your minds that way. But I think the reason that I feel that it's important to also have an awareness in ourselves is also to aid conversation, because I think one of the ways that it can happen that people do then go and search out like online forums to find people who agree with them is because maybe they reality test with their friends and family, and their friends and family are like, shut up, that's stupid, or like, no, that's crazy, rather than a kind of, oh, can you just say a bit more about like where that's come from for you, and like, you know, I can see why you might think that, but you know, I look at it like this, and maybe it's worth considering this perspective, sort of aiding those discussions as well, because I think it's the self-awareness element, but also how we kind of are more open in our communications. I hope that answered your question. I'm not sure if it did.
I'm just wondering, on the kind of moral ways to effectively communicate, do we have any good field data, as it were, on what works? Like, you know, I know that the part of the problem is that most people are going with option A, which is be rude, political. But to what extent has option B been utilised by organisations? And are there any cases where we've seen it, but you know, across a swathe of belief actually being more effective?
Yeah, I don't know about this kind of more robust studies. I think I've heard like case studies and kind of people using them and testing them out. I know that when we're talking more about the effectiveness of working with mimetic frames, there are organisations that focus on using like, I guess, field research around specific topics. So if you're wanting to communicate about poverty, for example, if we talk about it like X thing, or if we talk about like Y thing, it will affect how people view the issue itself. So there's that. But then in terms of the actual kind of specific examples, there's a really good one again in the Ant Hill podcast where they use where they talked about kind of vaccine hesitancy in Ireland around the HPV vaccine, and how they kind of they specifically used a kind of an example of someone who was vaccine hesitant, and then talked about why they were vaccine hesitant, and then said why they changed their mind, as a way of kind of saying, like, I can see why you might think this, but this is why it's good, why it's good for you, and here is the evidence around it. And I think there was a kind of 30% uptick in sign up for the virus. So I know that there have been kind of individual cases where they've seen success. I don't know about a kind of whole robust study. If anyone else does, that would be useful to share.
I want to build on that, and I was just thinking a big part of why, option A has dominated the discourse is really because what we're thinking about here is more a general state of being, or prevention of it's similar to how I said, trust leaves a lot quicker than it comes. It's really that idea of prevention versus combat, because when things have gone wrong enough, you actually need that kind of hard defense on the public media to prevent that information taking hold when the first exposure effect or whatever. To what extent is that a reason? To what extent do you subscribe to this being a reason of why we might not have seen that kind of approach in these more extreme communities?
Yeah, so I think if I understand your point, as you're talking, I was just thinking, almost like if you think about it as inoculation, would you take a kind of social approach that's almost like clinical control trials, where you almost have a control group that doesn't get kind of this inoculation of information and debate, which would be quite hard to test, wouldn't it? Because it would depend on each and every individual's kind of own peer groups and what the information, so it'd be kind of hard to have that kind of controlled environment of these people only receive messages of kind of love and support and willing for discussion, versus these people only receive kind of abject hate and kind of mocking and things like that. So I mean, we could maybe try and design a study. It'd be quite hard.
We've got Britain.
Yeah, but it's a really great question, I think. Thank you for raising it.
I have a similar, not similar, but like related, I think, question of I really buy into this, that this is seems to me like just intuitively like a better way to approach this. But I imagine that like one of the big counterpoints in terms of like this concept of like trying to find common ground with people who believe in these things and trying to meet them where they're at is the risk of like sort of entertaining these kinds of theories and maybe reinforcing them by like by entertaining them. And I'm like, as you were talking also, I was thinking that maybe this works in the other way around, of like we're similarly finding these theories like threatening to our worldview, and this is also why a lot of them that ended up being true were also like ridiculed and mocked in the beginning. So this is an impossible question. I'm just wondering about like your thoughts on it, but like where you draw the line sort of between like entertaining these sorts of things and trying to appreciate that like reality in the world is way more complex than any of us can perceive it to be, and like having to draw a line of where something where we have to agree on like mutual facts to have a conversation about anything, because everything's up for grabs then.
For sure, I think it's really difficult. I mean, it's difficult. It's very difficult in a in a communications, when you're doing mass communications, like if you're doing government communications. I was thinking about this a lot when I re-listened to. There was a moment where in one of the kind of important press government communications during the pandemic, where you would have the kind of chief scientists and then the Prime Minister talking, and someone asked about this link between COVID and 5G, and it was fielded quite correctly to one of the scientists, who straight away said, "That's absolute nonsense, like shut it straight down." And I think that would have been an informed response. My question in my mind was to dismiss it and be like, that's nonsense. Is that enough? Like, is it enough to say, I can see why you might have arrived at that, and I've heard some of the arguments, and it's really easy when we're in a scary time to speculate and to look for certainty, but it's not the case. Like, so maybe there's this kind of, it's actually maybe a kind of patronizing point to draw on because it comes from like parenting guidance, but there's this phrase of like connect before you correct. Like, don't just start saying to your kid, don't do that. You'd be like, I can see what's going on with you here, but we're not doing that. And so I think I think it's really difficult because it kind of goes back to the question that I was kind of pondering. And a lot of this is, it's great to hear that you guys have liked my argument, but within the spirit of what we're talking about here is take it all with a pinch of salt and be inquiring, because that's the danger of being wholesale brought into an argument. And I question myself all the time. It's really hard to make a presentation when you're doing it. But yeah, I think to your question about where do we draw the line, I think when you're thinking about it in terms of having individual conversations with individual people, recognizing it's not going to happen in one conversation. And I think that's the important point of being like, it's over time. And if there's a sense that conspiracy theories are self-sealing and they ostracize people from their normal social groups, you kind of need to leave the door ajar. Because I think another point in the point where Tom Harwood is kind of saying these slurs about individuals, and he wouldn't be the only one. I don't mean to kind of sort of single him out, but it was just quite a good example. Is if you're someone who's sort of leaning towards that belief and you see that and you say, well, in his world, I'm a great unwashed lunatic, and in this conspiracy theory world, I'm a hero who's like fighting for this just cause. Which one are you going to lean towards? Trying to make the world that you're inhabiting, that you want to give space for people to kind of come back into, and an inviting place to be. I think that's the spirit of where some of the kind of trying to avoid those negative beliefs comes in, is just giving people a bit of space to be like, look, it's safe when you want to come out. Like, you're not going to be ostracized forever. And I think there's thinking around that within sort of conspiracy theory adjacent areas like cults, de-radicalization, pyramid schemes, a sense of they all work in similar ways where you send someone out on a limb and then it's dangerous for them to return. So kind of leaving that pathway open, I think.
In your final tips, it's very much understanding that fear and information, and also avoid blaming. Both of these are very targeted on the social side of things, which I guess makes sense because it's only through that you can address the others. What kind of macro ways do you see of this being achieved? I guess, I don't know, like I've seen government being aware that marginalized communities are more likely to be more vulnerable to misinformation in the first place, have used leading figures within these communities to communicate key points. Are there other ways of that you've seen of mass messaging reaching people who are more socially ostracized and that have been successful?
No, it's a good question. It's a good question. I'm trying to have a bit of a think. Yeah, I think I can't. Nothing's coming to me at the moment, I'm afraid. Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's difficult. And maybe that's because they aren't there, or because I haven't seen them, and also because I'm not within one of those communities, so I can't. And again, I can't say whether they've been successful. But yeah, I'll kind of ponder that one. And I'm sorry not to get you an answer.
I guess the trust system within these communities and the systems that make decisions are not the same ones. So it's by definition difficult to find that overlap, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can, in terms of, and I know this is frustrating when it comes to kind of this question of solutions, when you don't have a kind of an active solution, but it's like a things to avoid doing. And I think what was really key was around your question, Sophia, around this trust question is, if you're going to put all of that work into really doing micro-targeting, really trying to engage, actively engage, encourage kind of ambassadors to go out and speak to their communities, like pay for influencer campaigns, all of that, don't just undo it by just treating the country with contempt. I know I'm bringing my own personal perspectives in there, but it was clear, it was also clear just how many people reacted to that and how that undoes the work like that. And I think it's really important to see how things connect. And you know, you can never know what the implications of an ill-judged move are going to be. But I think it's thinking really carefully of like a lot of these things are connected. And when you're looking at something from really far away, you don't see the nuance of, oh, you know, they were working together all day, so it didn't make a difference because they were all in, like all of these things, they don't so much make a difference when you're from far away and you already have a kind of preconception that there's a huge gulf between you and the people in power. So that's just one example, but it's a sense of, it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of time, like you've said. There are ways to really easily undo it. So it's kind of looking at the whole picture as well of like where trust indicators come in, not just particularly with your topic, but in the whole picture.
Can I ask something that's very, like, I'm very personally interested in, and I'm wondering what you think, because like as you've been talking about this now, like before I came here, I worked for a bit in like politics and policy spaces, and I did a bit of communication stuff, and something that's like a very big no-no, it seems to me, especially in like politics, is for like public figures to acknowledge like vulnerability or to acknowledge their shortcomings. And what just like, if I was thinking when I was working in these spaces was like, if people were just able to do that, it seems like a lot of things that end up undermining trust when they inevitably as humans fail or like make a mistake or slip up, would be undermined by just like acknowledging that, you know, you're a human who can make mistakes and who has shortcomings and who doesn't know everything.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, because you are, you know, you work in communications, I'm wondering if there's any evidence on that or any like thinking about how that contributes to like the perception of people in particularly in like authority spaces.
Yeah, I think I agree with you in that people know what a political answer looks like, which is avoid the question, move on. I think when it comes to specifically the area that I work in, which is kind of how to communicate, you know, public policy research, essentially, which is again kind of, you could argue that our organisation was kind of set up in response to that Michael Gove quote of like the public are tired of experts from acronym organisations telling them what to think. That's kind of a lot of what we're talking about, in that like we recognise that research and evidence plays a massive role in society, and we can't afford to just like for it to be maligned and ignored because of this sense of like they're part of the elite and they don't connect to people. And so we will often talk about just trying to think about how you can communicate as a human being to other human beings, which I guess I know maybe you're talking about more kind of government, and because it's not exactly, I'm not a government communications expert, although I've kind of given my own pirate radio view of some government communications here already. What we would kind of say is like, you read so many reports, PDFs published online, which kind of have a real detachment to them, and then you speak to a researcher for 5 minutes and they tell you an amazing story about the importance of their research and why it's important and where it's come from. So I think, I know this is not directly answering your question, but the sense of like us being able to, even when we're in kind of official serious roles, be able to be human beings in that role, I think is really important for us to be able to kind of better share information and make information and arguments more accessible.
I mean, I'm not just thinking of this in terms of exclusively in terms of politics, because I'm getting the sense that a lot of like science communicators, or just like communicators in general, have this assumption that people are like not capable of dealing with complexity. So they're like, let's not confuse them. Let's just like say the one thing and be like, this is it, and that's the end. And like, and I think like with COVID as well, for me, like as a non-communications expert, it seemed like a big problem, because like you had a lot of experts and people come out and say like authoritatively, this is it, this is the end, for an evolving situation, that then evidence would emerge and like disprove what they just said, and then they would just come out and say, oh no, this is true, and like what we were saying before isn't. For example, like with the masks in the beginning of the book, masks on. It seems to me like if you could just acknowledge that, you know, this is an evolving situation, you know, we don't have all the data, this seems to be where things are.
Yeah, I think you're right. I had so many points at once in my head, but I think it's a really good question. I guess to one thing, I think what it really highlighted was the importance of like putting in that groundwork when we're not in a crisis moment, so that people kind of have an ongoing relationship and understanding of kind of how we generate knowledge and how kind of the scientific process works, so that you're not having to do that while also kind of communicate in a crisis. I think you're really right in that. I think one thing that conspiracy theories perfectly illustrates is that people do have an ability to deal with complexity, and that's some of the like complex and like elaborate stories within conspiracy theories. It's quite mind-blowing that people do have a capacity to deal with it, and also sometimes a desire to look for it and seek it and be curious. And I think I've listed here the Flat Earth documentary on Netflix because I think it's a really good watch if you guys haven't watched it, in the sense of there is some real curiosity with some people here. They just maybe have been let down by kind of mainstream education. But I think to your point around people do have a capacity to deal with complexity, but it's how you take them on that journey into complexity, I think is really important, because there is also the element of which, like, how much you're giving people at once, which can be the issue with some sort of academic and science communication flow. It's like, here's everything, and you get to a saturation point really quickly, as maybe I've just illustrated. But I think like taking people on a journey through, and also Jonathan Van Tam is really good at using metaphor to be like, okay, maybe you don't quite understand exactly how kind of vaccine storage requirements are, but I can use the metaphor of a yogurt to be like, that's not, he said something like, yeah, it's not a yogurt. And he also used like a train metaphor at one point, and that's so helpful for making people to make links in their minds to be like, I understand how that works, and you said it's like that, so now I'm kind of with you on that. And I can talk about the power of metaphors, and it's a really important communication tool.
It's almost like jumping on what Sophia said, because it almost took the words out of my mouth. So I've obviously heard a lot of people saying that we need better science communication, but that's quite hard to define. And I was just wondering if you thought that, like, what do you think would be the key facets of better science communication? Like, what does that mean to you? Does it sort of fit with what, traditional, say, natural scientists would consider better science communication? Because I think every scientific field has its own idea of what good communication is.
Do you sound like you're speaking as someone who knows and has heard these arguments? I'm wondering if you could give me some examples of what you've heard people say is good science communication.
Well, I mean, my PI will tell me one thing, and then so because I've heard people sort of use the idea of sort of like, use more images than text. I've heard people say sort of like, oh, simplify the word, take that complicated word out or define it or something like that. But that's still sort of in an academic environment. Like, your audience is still academic. If you're writing a poem for abstract, it's still academic. But your average, like, you're going to talk to your average person on the street, they still might not get what you're on about in your abstract. And I just sort of wonder if you how you think that science communication could actually be better, and what would help with the general public.
That's a really good question. I actually think, and maybe I'm biased and being mean, but I think there's a lot of good science communications out there, potentially better than some public policy communications, just because in some areas of science you see a real, like, it's just really wholesome. there's a real wholesomeness to like, we're so enthusiastic about this, and it's really cool, and like, I really want to teach you about it, and I'm going to find a way to do it. And like, we see stuff in documentaries on TV all the time and things like that. So I think I've already mentioned metaphor, and I think metaphor is really important to find a way to take a vast, complex thing and try and make it relatable. Because I think thinking in terms of like stepping stones, if you're trying to get someone from somewhere that, and you're getting them all the way over here, they're not going to do that journey in one go. It's sort of how you can step them through the journey. And I think metaphor is really good for helping make those links. And I think story as well. I think Wellcome trusts are really good at kind of making science accessible, because they draw a lot from, they kind of sit at the intersection of like science and the arts, and kind of creativity. There was a really good piece in The New Scientist. My partner really likes The New Scientist, and he said, was like, this sounds like your sort of thing. He was talking about using imagination and creativity to kind of do that bridging as well. And yeah, like I say, kind of breaking it down step by step, so that it's not this kind of flood. And yeah, maybe defining your jargon, but people can deal with new terms, but just as there's not too many at once. Again, it's just kind of how you lead them through the process a little bit. And kind of really, again, tapping into you as an individual is like why you find this so fascinating, what makes it fizzy for you, what story have you heard or whatever that you can kind of use to kind of bring people in and kind of get them on the same page as you. I'm conscious that I'm happy to keep taking questions. I don't know if some of you are reaching your limit. Like, I think these are all great questions. But don't feel like you have to say if you've reached your saturation point. Again, happy to.
Yeah, I could that, but also, but I think both of these they touched on your point about narratives matching mimetic themes, and a big part of that is not oversimplifying things. But that's exactly what's going on a lot of the time. And I guess the root cause of that is because it's really hard to gauge where the public is, and what normally happens is overestimating knowledge and underestimating intelligence in a sense. So
yeah, I think that's really
which I guess is why when you say metaphors, actually attempting to explain complex things to people is a good idea, and things like stories and stuff, they're great. But you also talked about something to do with the baseline knowledge of the public so that they respond better to crisis communication. Things like, I think you said that science changes over time and things that can be wrong, etc. Is anything else in this category you think would, well, apart from inoculation and what we discussed, would prime the public to better responding to?
Yeah, I think you sum that up really nicely. I think I mentioned films, and I think culture, like using culture, like getting out there, getting kind of stories out there, and it's a little bit. I think there's been lots of talk about how a way we talk about like the climate emergency and how no one wants to watch a documentary or a film about the climate emergency because it's too depressing. But like, how did we weave that into all of our other stories? Like, it's a topic for all of us. How do we? It sounds like Trojan horse, but it's not. It's like it's part of our lives now. So how do we make that kind of a kind of narrative that goes alongside our other narratives in a way that kind of makes it accessible? So I think use of culture is really important, like film, TV. Yeah, that's another one. But I really like the way that you said that, and I think that it's really important. Like you say, it's really hard to gauge where the public is at, and that's why it's really hard when you're in a kind of crisis situation. Is because like when we do communications in my organization, the first place we start is research. We're like, where's your audience? Like, what do they think about this already? Where are they at? And that's really hard to do. I mean, you can do some sort of polling and quick turnaround stuff, but in terms of like the real kind of intricate stuff, it's really hard to do fast. And I think kind of there's some level at which it's like getting beyond the kind of firefighting and looking ahead. I think there are some people who say that vaccine hesitancy has been a thing for a long time, and there are moments where it's really risky when it flares up. So how can you again work that inoculation and kind of really investigating what's going on there, and then kind of working continuously on that, not just when it's really important. It's interesting how people like me and many other people are suddenly really worried about conspiracy theories because it affects them, but actually they've been there for a really long time, and it's much more about kind of questions about how we nurture common ground and nurture kind of that shared reality and that kind of the same shape of the world. Really. Yeah, but yeah, great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all of them. Thank you. And yeah, I'm interested as well if I can leave my contact as well, actually, because if you guys come across any interesting papers as we talked about and studies or anything you want to chat about further, as you can tell, I'm enthusiastic. Thanks so much for having me. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you. Last talk for you.
Marty.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm so uncomfortable. Ah, okay, it's back. It was